Hello everyone, welcome back. You're watching Avorion episode 9. I'm Enigmaeus, and today, all kinds of progress. I'm at the point now with this build where I feel like we should be wrapping it up fairly quick. We've been at it for a little while now. For the size of the ship, it's about time. It's getting to be about time. It's been a great learning experience. There will be more learning to be done with future builds. But I'm looking at wrapping this up after this episode. One more episode to finish the structural bits, and then an episode for the shakedown and blueprint reveal, if it's good enough to warrant a blueprint. And then we will move on from there. So one thing I wanted to show you very quickly before we move on with the new stuff is just this modification that I made to the profile of this front section. And I decided to show you the basics of the change, just so that there's a little bit of continuity and a little bit of context when we start working on the areas behind this on the ship. If you saw the last episode and recognized something was different but couldn't quite put your finger on what, at least now you have a pretty good idea of exactly what that is. It actually took me an hour and 20 minutes to rework this little section, just because it came together a certain way when we were working towards creating a certain profile, and when I changed the profile, it didn't necessarily want to go back together the same way. So I definitely didn't want to spend another episode on that part of the ship. I didn't think that would be fair. So you get an idea now, after it's all done, how we changed the profile, then we got it all put back together. I'm pretty happy with the way it turned out. I don't have any complaints about that. So now we're working on this side panel in the rear section of the ship, and this is sort of where it started to go bad with the first iteration on this ship, where things didn't come together close enough to one another, and as a result it ended up being like a limousine more than a muscle car. You can see now that I'm deliberately going out of my way to keep this rear section pushed right up against the front section. We've only got the slightest gap between the two. And something else you may have noticed is that we're using very small blocks. And this is something that I've been talking about for the last couple of episodes. How using small blocks gives you more control over things like curves and making things look as organic and natural as possible. Whereas using larger blocks obviously lets you fill in space faster. But when it comes time to make different transitions and curves going around different directions, you get larger faces and things just don't look as refined as they would if they were made with smaller blocks. So working our way through here, there's basically two things that I'm looking at. First of all, using the smaller blocks so I get that increased granularity, that increased resolution, in order to make things fit together easier as we work our way through it. And also, as you can see, I'm spending a little bit of time now doing my best to make sure that there are no gaps between the part that we're building right now and that mostly flat section that we're building it on, because it's not entirely flat. There are some curves to it, and if we just sort of throw things down without really thinking about it, we are going to end up with gaps, and they're the kind of gaps that just really bug me when I see them. And it's one of those things where it bugs me, and I know it bugs me, and I know it's going to continue to bug me, so I have to fix it. I can't just leave it, and if I know that, then there's no point putting it there in the first place if I can avoid it. It's just one of those things. So this being the second time that we've built this part of the ship, I decided to put a little bit of attention into making sure that everything fit together properly the first time, and hopefully save the aggravation of having to redo it more times than we already have. I think that's sort of the key. So you can see it's a very, I guess it's sort of an abrupt curve coming around the side. It's not, you know, it's not a drawn out sort of curve. It's like you've got it going one direction perpendicular to the hull, and then a very short distance later it's going parallel to the hull. And that to me is, you know, I'm fine with it as long as the transition sort of fits with my idea of what this side of the ship should look like, and that's sort of the gradual soft curves, because you don't see too much geometry on the bodies of cars these days. It's there from time to time, but there's a lot more curves than there are flat faces. Now this area here is an example of working my way through the learning curve until I find a solution. This is a perfect example of that situation where everything just goes out of alignment by half a block, and it feels like there's nothing you can do to make it go back into alignment. But what I discovered is if we place that block, that rectangular block that just had no other purpose for being there, by placing something like that, you can force it into alignment again, even though you're not using the match feature to line up with anything like that. It's just having that block there and sort of gently pushing the intended block up against it. It forces it into alignment, and you don't have to worry about that little half block gap anymore, which is kind of a big deal, because if you're forced to settle for that and you just continue building knowing that that gap is there, it throws everything out of whack, and you either end up with seams that don't have any gaps, but the geometry overlaps in bad spots, so you get little jagged things sticking out from time to time, or you get the gaps. So one way or the other, there's no good outcome. And so in this case, I was glad to finally discover that little solution. It was not difficult to implement this time around because I had lots of room that I could place blocks to work against. We'll see if we can come up with a reliable and consistent solution for maybe some tighter quarters that we might encounter in some other builds. But for now, to have at least come up with a general solution was pretty cool. I was pretty happy about that. There are a couple of sections that I've trimmed out of this part of the build, and it's mostly just things that took a long time but didn't actually accomplish a whole lot. It's unfortunate. Sometimes it happens like that, but just in the interest of time, I didn't want to spend a lot of time on things that didn't actually show progress. So in this case, what you're seeing is, again, a lot of little wee tiny blocks being stacked against one another. We're not changing the size, the angle, anything like that. We could get the same line, the same profile out of a larger block in a lot less time, but then when we go to wrap it around and do the transition, it goes to hell. So this is sort of an extreme example of little wee tiny increments working our way up the backside like this, and it pays off when we get to the final stages of this particular profile, this part of the structure, when we have nice curves and everything sort of works out the way that I had in mind. It's getting to that point now where things work out a lot faster and in a lot more straightforward of a way than they did when I first started building with this game. Just getting used to things. One of the nice things about doing that thing with the little wee tiny blocks, stacking one on top of the other, is very satisfying, because the game does a good job of remembering from one block to the next what you just used, so that quite often you don't have to readjust blocks. You just stack, switch and stack, going back and forth, and being able to select blocks from a hotbar and kind of proceed that way. It goes very, very quickly, and it's very, very satisfying when that happens, just because you're making rapid progress with very little thought investment, I guess you could say. And now we're basically just working the profile down on a slope towards what we've already got in place. So we got sort of little narrow angles, again working in smaller bits just to keep things nice and granular, keep the resolution up. And then when we finish off making that connection, it's just a matter of going around and sort of working those curves, bringing them down so that we've got the perpendicular transitioning to parallel, so to speak. Get the side built in, and then there's a few more details that I wanted to add. I wanted to put the scoops on the sides, again, just because I like them. And like I was mentioning, when I first put them on the previous iteration of the ship, they were one thing that I could add that you don't expect to see on a muscle car, so it sort of reinforces that spaceship sort of end of things. I find it just makes it a little bit less ludicrous when we've got a spaceship that looks a little bit too much like a car. You just sort of add these extra things to reinforce the differences, the subtle differences, and it ends up being a little bit better, in my opinion, than if we were to just kind of go with the car theme outright, which would be a little bit of a concern. This is sort of the example, again, of, first of all, things going very quickly, because you can work your way up and you don't have to worry about changing the block or changing the size of the block. everything is sort of done, the layout is done, so you're just working with what you've got, what you've already planned. It goes very, very quickly. We get the curve that we wanted, we get that transition that we wanted, and then it's just a matter of going around and sort of filling it in with the flat sheets. And at this point, feeling like I don't really have to do a whole lot of pre-planning in terms of how I want to orient these larger pieces now. They're basically the final structural elements. In this part, we're going to be putting that sort of scoop on the side of here, but we'll be aligning that scoop independently of the match feature. We won't be using the match feature to line it up because there's nothing to line it up with. So we could just kind of put those big panels in place, make them fit whatever is most convenient, and then we come back around, turn off the match feature so that we can put things wherever we want and focus on just getting the start of this element right. The right scale from top to bottom, the right position, sort of looking at this is generally where the front I would expect it to be, and then we can take and work it back towards the hull on a very gradual, smooth, even curve. And this is, if there was any one feature of the game that I still think of in terms of something that I absolutely love, it's the ability to do this with something that's such a very simple element, but spending a little bit of time setting it up, adjusting the scale of one block after another, making it a little bit shorter in order to make the angle a little bit wider, and then by the time you get to the end, you look at it and you can't even really see anymore where the individual lines were that made up this curve. It's such a gradual thing. I think that's absolutely fantastic. I'd probably never get tired of it. In this case, it works well with the aesthetic of the vehicle, more so than if it was just big and blocky and sort of attached to the side that way. And then the majority of the profile is already done. It's at this point we're just sort of deciding how we want the sidewalls of this particular structure to work together, and I've decided that I want a little bit of a transition, a little bit of a curve coming down off the sides, so we can put that into place. And then we'll have the partitions in the front, just this structural element to add a little bit more detail to the overall design. And then all that's really left for this episode is to jam a bunch of equipment in there, which I decided, because it's the blocks that make up the equipment are really not that interesting to look at for the most part. They're just sort of there, and they have occasionally certain markings that you can look at and identify that that's a particular kind of thing. But there's still rectangles and cubes and stuff like that that you put into place. There's not really a whole lot of special detail that delineates them from the other blocks that you're working with. One of the things that I noticed this time around, I wanted to look a little bit closer at the actual parameters of the ship, the maneuvering characteristics, the pitch, yaw, roll, maximum speed, acceleration, things like that, and sort of get a feel for what was changing as I was adding these different blocks. And one of the things that I found is that it was fairly straightforward to get the pitch, yaw, and roll to come up, and fairly dramatically relative to you know, what you have if you just put a couple of blocks into place. You don't need a lot in order to make a difference, I guess would be a reasonably apt summary. So there was that. The other thing that I noticed is that we had 4 engines basically sticking out of the back of the ship, and at that time it was saying that our top speed was 202 meters per second, which, if I understood it correctly, is just a little bit faster than our drone, and that's not too bad. I could sort of live with that. Somewhere between that 202 meters per second plus adding all this stuff that we did to the side of the ship and all of the other equipment that we added to the inside, and adding 4 more engines on the back, it still dropped below 50 meters per second. And I'm thinking that might change when we get some crew inside. I think that's going to be sort of the big factor at this point in terms of the overall performance, is what's going to happen when we get the crew hired. And I guarantee you, when we place this ship in a survival world, when we build it, however the blueprint system works in this game for importing ships in survival, it's going to be done right next to a station so that we can hire crew immediately and not have to worry about not surviving the trip from wherever we placed it to wherever we need to go. I learned from that sort of scenario, and I don't wish to repeat it ever again. That was pretty bad. So you can see we've got basically this scoop done. Just kind of doing the last little bit of tweaking. Then we'll put in the partitions and we'll finish that off, get all the other stuff inside. The next episode is going to be all the underside of the ship, and I already have a very good idea of what I want to do there. I'm going to spend a little bit of time browsing the wiki to kind of get a handle on the technical aspects and sort of finalizing my decisions on what equipment we're going to have in place and why. The episode after that will be the survival shakedown, and if the ship is up to snuff, the blueprint reveal. So 2 more episodes is what I'm calling as the timeline for this particular build, and then we'll be moving on to the next ship, which I have some tentative ideas about, but I'll be refining that a little bit as well before we sort of get down into the meat and potatoes of it. I don't want to start a build without having at least 70% of the concept done in my head. So if you want to be notified about the next episode, the easiest way to do that is to subscribe to my channel or follow me on social media. Links for social media are always in the information section below the video. Feel free to leave comments and feedback. There's about a minute left here. You can just watch. There's a little bit of a pan around so that you can see the ship once we've got the equipment in it, sort of what it looks like. So feel free to leave your comments and feedback. Thanks for watching, guys, and take care.